Warning. You have entered the realm of the gods. So give us your mind and your full attention.
So you say you deal with esoteric information? I never heard of such.
Well, you're in for a treat.
Blog talk, this is the blog talk. I lean El-Bey, dropping jewels every day. Blog talk, this is the blog talk. Metaphysical, we deal with the spiritual. Blog talk, this is the blog talk. I lean El-Bey, dropping jewels every day. Blog talk, this is the blog talk. Metaphysical, we deal with the spiritual. So you claim to be a god?
Damn right I'm a god. The maker, the owner, cream of the planet Earth, father, civilization, god of the universe. Wow, I didn't know that. Wow, I didn't know that. Wow, I didn't know that. Wow, I didn't know that.
So tune in or lose, friend. All strategies applied mathematically. The information he drop is real powerful. So get your notepad, it's more than an hour full. Watch your jaw, the crew is watching talk. Indigenous to the land wherever we stand. First world order, we bringing it home in the first quarter. Invisible lines don't apply, we cross borders. Silly rabbit, knowledge for gods. No matter where you reside, Lodge, Temple of Mars. So don't fret or proceed with hesitation. Just tune in to Blog Talk to get the information. Peace.
Peace, family. It's Brother Faheem with the L again. I'm filling in for Dr. Alim El-Bey for the night. Okay. I'm sorry about for my absence from the show last week. I know we got a little confused on who was supposed to do the Blog Talk show, but we got it together, got it straightened out. So I'm awful sorry, and I hope you accept my apology for not being on the show last week. It's just a little misunderstanding. So, okay, but I'm here tonight, and I'm here to touch on a certain topic for tonight. Hope everything is all right with you and yours and your family and all across the world. Okay? All right. Our topic on me tonight is dealing with Moors, the Civil War, and why did Moors fight in the war and slavery. Okay? Yeah, there's been a lot of, the reason why I want to touch on this subject tonight is a lot of misconceptions or misunderstandings and misleading information as well on the so-called Civil War, why it was fought, who started what, the reason why things turned out the way it did before, during, and after the Civil War, and things dealing with, of course, us as Moors or as an Aboriginal, Indigenous, Autochthonous people of this land. A lot of, we all know, those who are listening tonight, and those who know, for those who don't know, that the history has been so miscrewed and so confused and twisted, to suit the agenda of the ruling elite, to the people who are running things now, to suit their agenda. Those who know this as well as I do, probably before I start to get involved in consciousness, and especially in the Moorish Divine National Movement. So I'm getting on. I'm going to read this part here to you all. But before I start reading, I want to mention other things too about the Civil War, Moors, and slavery. A lot of us know that a lot of us fought on the side of the Union States of America on a what you call a noble venture or reason was noble to fight against slavery, to fight against the South and everything like that. Very few people know that slavery, the Civil War, or as some may say, the War of the Rebellion, which it was known at that time. They didn't come to call the Civil War in history books. So, but very few people know that the Civil War was fought for many reasons, economic reasons, mainly for the sovereign rights of southern states that was in the South. It wasn't about slavery. It's about, who taking over or over what, who's got, and that's what it was about. It wasn't about slavery. It wasn't about, it was about economics. I can tell you that. And it's about sovereign rights and sovereign rights of certain citizens of each state in the South. How many people know what I wonder, and I know I've asked this question on several blog talk shows before in the past. I don't know if those who remember the blog talk shows I've done on the subject. How many of you know that when the Civil War was declared? How many of you know? I wish I had a keyboard where I can punch people in, but I still don't have one. So, but I wonder how many of you know. I tell you this: how many of you know that the Civil War was never declared? How many of you know this? It was never declared. Abraham Lincoln never went to Congress for a declaration of war against the South. All what happened was a cannon was fired at Fort Sumter in 1861. In 1861, by a Confederate captain, I think he was the father of Jesse James. I forget his name. It was fired. It was ordered by Captain Jesse James' father. By Jesse James' father, which he was a captain Confederate in the Army at that time. It was fired on Fort Sumter. That's when they actually started fighting. But the Civil War was never declared. It was an undeclared war. Because, see, Abraham Lincoln never went to Congress for a declaration. I say again, Abraham Lincoln never went to Congress for a declaration of war against the South. Of course he didn't. How are you going to declare war against your own nation? Or I can put it this way. How are you going to declare a war against, say, another company in the same nation or country? Which the Confederate States of America was the Virginia Company, and the Union Northern States was the New England Company. They were both companies at that time. And the Southern states were killing the Northern industrialists in economics. That's a fact. But the main reason the South wanted to go to war with the South, the North wanted to go to war with the South, is because all of their states were sovereign, and a lot of them involved Moors. Moors own a lot of land in the South. They own slaves. They did own our own Asiatic people, but they also own European people as well. That's what a lot of people don't want to talk about. They don't want that out. They don't want that out that we once enslaved so-called white people. But they'll tell you quick that we enslaved our own. They'll tell you quick about that. Some of you still having a hard time dealing with that. some of you said there's no evidence of that. Oh, I can assure you it's been recorded. It's been recorded also that so-called black people own land in the South. A lot of land. Because at one time, so-called black people ruled the South, believe it or not. It is up to you whether you want to believe that or not. It's up to you whether you want to take that account as factual history or false history. You can take it or leave it. But I'm here to give you the facts as I know it, as I studied, read books, studied different documents, talked to different people, get on YouTube, on the internet, did research. And there's nothing like research, doing your own research, believe me. Because if you don't believe me, what I'm telling you tonight, do your own research. Go ahead and seek and find. And, make up your mind for yourself. Whether this is factual history or not. Okay? I'm going to read here from this page. It's called Fiend Sovereign Voting Rights. It has here in the picture with the canon law and ordinance of the Union States Society, U.S. of A. Is Romans getting ready to fire. Okay? It says here, the Union States ordinances are designed and used to maintain the economic and social oppression, servitude, and control over the descendants of the defeated Moors. Through fraudulent acts, rules and regulations, laws, compel, taxation, all this without lawful representation. The defeated and branded Moors have never been allowed to exercise their sovereign rights or have mutual participation in the Union States government. Why? Because the Moors are not and cannot be citizens in the Union States, and the Union States colonists' sovereign claims is a fiction. The states are foreign corporation appendages, not the land. The only true and de jure natural citizens are the indigenous Moors. The Moors are we, the people of the land. The state colonists are alien usurpers and should never be viewed as anyone or anything other than just that, foreign thieves. They unlawfully occupy the Moorish provinces commonly known as the Americas or Almarocs. The passage of time will never change this fact. The natural law and sovereign power of the defeated Moors, branded Negro, black, colored, etc., has always been suppressed through and by the colony states using coercion and force, even with the blindly respected Voting Rights Act. Fraud is the fact. There is no such thing as a voting rights for any non-Union citizens. Voting in the United States society for anyone other than the European Albion male is only by limited privilege. Voting Rights Acts can never be law in the United States of America and cannot be backed by constitutional law. Voting rights applies seven precipitation on the part of the subjugated Moors. The Voting Rights Act was actually based on the 14th Amendment, but never was properly ratified, as I spoke many times before in previous blog talk shows. Okay? That's just one little part I just read to you. Let me get on here. The thing about slavery. How many people know the true history of slavery? Not only just in the South, but all over the world. How many people know? Was it just so-called black people that were slaves, or they were all people of other nationalities that were slaves at one time. If you did your research real hard, you will find out that at one time all nationalities and ethnicities were slaves at one time. The word slave is actually related to the European or Eastern European Slavic people, known as Slav, not our people, in case those who didn't know. We were known at that time as prisoners of war. I'm going to read you something from here, a call from the story of the Moors after Spain. Also deals with slavery. Okay? The dispatch showed that the Corsairs, Moors, had speedily mastered the new manner of navigation. As might have been expected of a nation of sailors, they had long been acquainted with the great galaxy of Spain and Venus, as sort of a compromise between the rowed galley and the sailing galleon, for it was too heavy to depend wholly on its oars, which by the way of distinction were rowed under cover, and its great laden sails were generally its motive power. The galleys themselves, moreover, had sails through not square sails, and the seaman who can sail a ship on Latin sails soon learns the management of the square rig. Now I'm gonna read you the one the page I intended to read. Okay, here it is. It was a piteous sight. Oh, hold on, I'll go back to here. Sorry. Okay, in 1627, Murad, a German renegade, took 3 Algerine ships as far north of Denmark and Iceland, whence he carried off 400, some 8,800 captives, and not to be outdone, his namesake Murad Ritz, a Fleming, in 1631 ravaged the English coasts and passing over to Ireland, descended upon Baltimore, sacked the town, and bore away 237 prisoners, men, women, and children, even from the cradle. You hear what I just said? Even from the cradle, talking about babies. Haven't been quite get born yet. Okay, let me move along. It says here, it was a piteous sight to see bows for sale at Algiers. Cries, good Father Dan, for then they parted the wife from the husband and the father from the child. Then say I, they sail, the husband here and the wife there, tearing them from her arms, the daughter whom she cannot hope to see ever again. Many bystanders burst into tears as they saw the grief and despair of these poor Irish. Of these poor Irish people. I'm talking about Europeans now. I'm not talking about Asiatic people. I'm not talking about Moors. These were done by the Corsairs. The Corsairs were Moors, if you want to know. The Barbary Corsairs, as they sometimes were called. Okay? As before, but with better confidence, they pursued their favorite course in the Levant and cruised across the Egyptian trade route, where are to be caught ships laden with the products of Cairo, Sands, and Bombay, and laid to the back of Cyprus to snare the Syrian and Persian goods that sailed from Scandurin and so home with the pleasant raid along the Italian coast. Now they started raiding the Italian coasts, touching perhaps at an island or two to pick up slaves and booty, and thus to the mole of Algiers and the welcome of their mates, in spite of all the ships of Christendom. Yep, okay. Says here, but in 1634, Father Dan found 20,000 Christian slaves in the city of Algiers, and roundabout, without counting 8,000 renegades, and so far as was the fleet from being diminished, except that there were few galleys. Now you're talking about he has found 25,000 Christian slaves. Now, when he said Christian slaves, who do you think he's talking about? Who do you think he's talking about? They were talking about Europeans, because at that time, Christianity was always, or Christian was always synonymous with European people, if you didn't know it or not. I know there are some of you that do know. Okay? It says, so far was the fleet from being diminished, except thenceforth for galleys, and the priests reckon no less than 70 sailing cruisers, from large 35 and 40 gun ships to ordinary gallants and payocas. And on August 7th, he himself saw 28 of the best of them sail away in the quest of Norman and English ships, which usually come to Spain. At that season, to take in wine and oil and spices. He added that the Tunis had been 14 palicos. So sailed 30 very swift caravels, drawing little water on account of the harbor. Altogether, the whole Barbary fleet, Moors, numbered 120 sailing ships, besides about 25 galleys and brigantines. Says here, Father Dan draws a miserable picture of the captives' life ashore. Nothing, of course, could equal the torment of the galley slaves, but the wretchedness of the shore slaves was bad enough. When they were landed, they were driven to the Bassetine, or slave market, where they were put auction, like the cattle which were also sold them, walked up and down by the auctioneer to show off their paces, and beaten if they were lazy or weary or seemed to sham. These are European slaves I'm talking about. Getting dogged out, okay? And the reason why I'm bringing this up, these are for you that don't think that, it was all about us being enslaved, and and we were so innocent, we were victims, because a lot of us love to play the victim role. Love to play that victim role. We need to start playing that victim role and start being responsible. And start holding responsibility for ourselves. And start playing that victim role. And start getting with other boys so we can build a nation. Okay. The purchasers were often speculators, and who attempted to sell again, brought off for the rise. In fact, and Christians, Europeans, are cheap today was a business quotation, just as though they had been stocks and shares. The prettiest women were generally shipped to Constantinople for the Sultan's choice. The Sultan's choice. The Sultan. You, the studious in your Moorish history and Moorish culture, you know what a Sultan is. A Sultan is a Moor. A Sultan holds a certain rank among the ranks of the Moors. This we know, don't we, Moors? Now I'm going to read this again. The prettiest women were generally shipped to the Constantinople for the Sultan's choice. Constantinople, I believe, today is known as Istanbul, Turkey. As you know, the Turks today, the Turkish people today, they are bleached out Moors, but they are known as Tony Moors. Most of them probably don't even know that, but they are. And a lot of them will tell you, they even resent the word European. Consider themselves European. I talked to one before. She don't even consider herself European or white. Why? Because they are Tony Moors. Okay. The rest were heavily chained and cast into vile dungeons and private houses till their work was allotted them, or into the large prisons or biganos, of which they were then 6 in Algiers, each containing a number of cells in which 15 or 16 slaves were confined. Every rank and quality of both sexes might be seen in these wretched dens, gentle and simplest priest and late and lag merchant and artisan, lady and peasant girl, some hopeful of ransom, others despairing ever to be free again. The old and the feeble were set to sail water, laden with chains. They led a donkey about the streets and doled out water from the skin upon his back. And an evil day it was when the poor captive did not bring home to his master the stipulated sum. Others took the bread to the bakehouse and fetched it back in haste for the Moors. For the Moors love hot loaves. Meaning anything they earned or anything they did, anything they were able to get, they turned over to the Moors. Some cleaned the house, since Mohammedans detest dirt, whitened the walls, washed the clothes, and minded the children. Others took the fruit to market, tended the cattle, or labored in the fields, sometimes sharing the yoke of the plow with a beast of burden. Worst of all was the sore labor of quarrying stone for building and carrying it down from the mountain to the shore. Are they dogging these people out, or are they not? You answer that for yourself. Doubtless, Father Dan made the worst of the misery he saw. It was not to the interest of the owners and to injure their slaves, who might be ransomed or resold, and at any rate were more valuable in health than in weakness and disease. The worst part of captivity was not the physical toil and blows, but the mental care, the despair of release, the crunking cake of proud hearts as to slave for taskmasters. Cruelty there certainly was, and even so staunch an apologist for the Moors as Joseph Morgan admits that, but it can hardly have been ruled. And the report of another French priest who visited Algiers and other parts of Barbary in 1719 does not bear out Dan's statement, nor is there any reason to believe. So you see, these are the doubts that they have. Okay, were worse treated in 1634 than in 1719. The later report with some Morgan's comments may be summarized thus: the slaves of Algiers are not indeed so unhappy, and those in the hands of the mountain Moors. I'm just putting things out there to see that you know that these are, you had some people say that slavery wasn't that bad on either side, but slavery is slavery, whatever how, you want to put it. You take, for instance, what you call European slaves, the indentured slaves. You know, a lot of them, some of them had signed contracts. You know, because when you sign a contract at that time, when you sign a contract, you agree for them to do anything they want to do to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. The the slave trade, which mainly from England, where they sold off a lot of their people from England, Ireland, Welsh, and Scotland. Hundreds of thousands of families. Says here, drawn up in the bowl, 1 in 8 is chosen by the day, by D-E-Y, by the day. So that's a Moorish term. That's a Moorish title. That's a Moorish surname. That's a noble name for the Moors. I'm going to say it again. Drawn up in the bowl, 1 in 8 is chosen by the day for his own share, and he naturally selects the best workmen and the surgeons and ship's masters who are at once sent to the government. Okay? The rest are to be divided equally between the owners and the equipage, and are taken to the Besistan and marched up and down by our auctioneers to the time of their merits, and calling till the highest bid is reached. This is, however, a merely formal advance, for the final sale must take place at the day's palace. D-E-Y, at the day's palace. Talking about another Moor, okay? Whether the captives and their would-be purchasers now resort. Those of you that have been nationalized or that study a lot of things about Moorish culture and history and tradition know that El-Bey, Day, Al, and Ali, those are noble names. Those are Moorish noble names and titles. So you know what I'm talking about. Okay. And I explain this so those who don't know. Says here, the second auction always realizes a much higher sum than the first, but the owners and equipage are only permitted to share the former price, while by a beautiful, simple process, the whole difference between the first and second sales go absolutely to the government. It says here, said news was then brought that the galleys of Malta had captured the Capitana, or flagship of Algiers, with 650 Turks and Moors aboard. Goes to show you that we did enslave our own. Okay? Besides, Christian slaves, there we go again, Europeans, to say nothing, killed and wounded, whereupon furiously incensed the day. Okay? A Moor again sent the imprisoned knights to the castle dungeon and loaded them with chains weighing 120 pounds, and there they remained cramped with irons in a protruded cavern, swarming with rats and other vermin. This is what's been going on. So they could hear the people passing in the streets without, and they clanked their chains. If so, by they might be heard, but none answered. At last, their condition came to the ears of the French consul, who threatened like penalties to Turkish prisoners in Malta unless the knights were removed. And the day on the lighten their chains by half and put them on in a better room. They were, but there were these that were an unhappy gentlemen remained for 8 long years, more save only at the great festivals of the church, when they were set free to join the religious rites of the French consulate, and once by formed a strange and feature in the wedding festivals in the consul, when they assumed their perukes and court dresses for the announce, only to be exchanged again for the badge of servitude, whom the joyful moment of liberty was over. Their treatment grew worse as time wore on. They were made even to drag trucks of stone, these knights of an heroic order, and hopeless of obtaining so large a sum as early as equivalent to $40,000 at that time, which was demanded their ransom. They managed to foul their chains and escape to the shore. These were done. Okay, they're talking about put on the show for certain people from the church, to show them that they were treated right. But as soon as they leave, they will dog them out again. This is what was going on. And these were some captured knights of Malta. Those of you who study history, European history, well, British is not European history because a lot of our history is so steeped in European history. And I'll advise a lot of you brothers and sisters to study European history. You really, really, really need to study it. Because there's a lot of our history in there. All over Poland, Russia, Germany, especially Germany, France, Holland, Belgium, Italy, Spain, even Sicily. Because Sicily was one time called Moorish Sicily at one time. That's why they are so dark. We go on here. Much to his credit, this worthy Muslim used his vast spiritual influence for their protectors, and the days spared their lives. At last, by the joint efforts of the friends and the captives. I'm going to stop right here. See, you had some Moors that were benevolent. Now, I'm not going to say all Moors at that time were non-benevolent people. I'm not trying to say that. So don't get me wrong. And I'm not, nowhere, no form or fashion trying to, trying to make light of European people, because I'm not. But all I'm trying to put out is here, brother, we were not innocent. This is mainly what this topic is about. Okay, let me move along here. Okay, it says here, he was an ace of execution, thanks to his own chivalry, and was kept for 5 months in the Moors' bagnio under strict watch. Though without blows, no one ever struck him during the whole of his captivity, though he often stood in expectation of impalement or some such horrible death. It says here, slavery in private houses, shops, and farms was tolerable or intolerable according to the character and disposition of the master and of the slaves. It says some were treated as members of the family, save the liberty as in the natural inclination of Muslims toward the slaves of their own religion. Like I said before, all of our people were barbaric. They were not, and that's not what I'm trying to put out here. This is the evidence right here that they treated some as a part of their family. Okay. Others, now here's the bad part. Others were cursed and beaten, justly or unjustly, and lived a dog's life. Okay? This is just some of the things I was reading from the story of the Moors after Spain. I just want to know you to ponder on that and take my advice to please do a lot of studying on history. European history as well as African history, as well as other history, but all of it study world history. That's number one, study world history. Because we were all over the world. And we ruled the world at one time. Okay, I'm going to move along here. Okay. Now here we come to the subject. I'm reading from the book called Moors in America, a compilation by Sister Jashida S. Naji Ulael and Brother Victor Taylor L. Okay? And you ought to get this book. It's called Moors in America. And I say again, the author's name is Sister Tashhida S. Naji Ulael and Brother Victor Taylor L. Very good book. Informative. Okay. It says here, Blacks, Moors in the Confederacy. Facts about Confederate blacks. Black Confederate fact sheet. Okay. Says here, since attachments give some people trouble, I am again posting my Black Confederate facts sheet, but this time it is the body of the message. Please renew this and let me know if there are any glaring errors. I plan to distribute this next month, and all the Black Yankee adoration is at fault. Well, at full force. Okay. Black Confederate. We have. Why haven't we heard more about them? National Park Service historians, Ed. Why haven't we? Ed Bear started. I don't want to call it a conspiracy to ignore the role of blacks, both above and below the Mason-Dixon line, but it was definitely a tendency to begin around 1910. Historians Edwin L. Jordan Jr. call it a cover-up, which started back in 1865. He writes, during my research, I came across instances where black men stated that they were soldiers, but you can plainly see where a soldier is crossed out and body servant inserted, or teamster, or pension applications. Another black historian, Roland Young, says he is not surprised that blacks fought. He explained that as much as not, most black Southerners would support their country, and that they, by doing so, they were demonstrating it a possible to hate the system of slavery and love one's country. This is the very same reaction that most so-called African Americans showed during the American Revolution, where they fought for the colonies, even though the British offered them freedom if they fought for them. But you did have Moors fighting for the British. Okay. It has been estimated that over 65,000 Southern so-called blacks were in the Confederate ranks. Over 13,000 of them, or of these, saw the elephant, also known as nesting the enemy in combat. These so-called black Confederates included both slaves and free. I'm going to say this again. These black Confederates included both slave and free, because all Asiatic people in the South were not slaves, never were slaves. The same as Europeans, although the first slaves that came to these lands, or the Almarocs or the Americas, were Europeans, believe it or not. They say fact or fiction. You do the math. Okay? Let me move along here. The Confederate Congress did not approve so-called blacks to be officially enlisted as soldiers, except as musicians, until late in the war. But in the ranks, it was a different story. Many Confederate officers did not obey the mandates of politicians. They frequently enlisted so-called black men with the simple criteria: will you fight? Historian Urban Jordan explains that the biracial units were frequently organized by local Confederates and state militia commanders in response to immediate threats in the form of Union raids. Okay? Dr. Leonard Raines, a so-called African-American professor at Southern University, stated, when you eliminate the so-called black Confederate soldier, you have eliminated the history of the South. Says here, number one, the Richmond howitzers were partially manned by so-called black militiamen. The Richmond howitzer. Now, some of you don't know what a howitzer is. The howitzer is a cannon that shoots bombs. Okay, some of you that have never been in the military are not familiar with these terms. So this is why I'm explaining to you, All right? Let me move along here. Read this again. Dealing with Richmond, Virginia, the Richmond howitzers were partially manned by so-called black militiamen. They saw action at First Manassas, or would you say the First Battle of Bull Run. Those of you who know about the Civil War know what the Battle of Bull Run was, okay, where they operated Battery Number 2. Battery Number 2. A battery is what you call a group of cannons. Soldiers found a group of cannons, Battery Number 2, Battery Number 1, Battery Number 15. So those are a group of cannoneers that's firing artillery at the enemy or shooting bombs at the enemy. Okay? I know some of you have seen movies dealing with the Civil War and other things like that, and so you probably know what I'm talking about. Okay? Let me move along here. Number 2, in addition, 2 so-called black regiments, 1 free and 1 slave, participated in the battle on behalf of the South. I'm going to read this again. In addition, 2 black regiments, 1 free and 1 slave, participated in the battle on behalf of the South. You had Moors that were slaves, and you had Moors that were free. Let me move it. Let me get them going in further now. Many colored peoples were killed in action, recorded from John Parker, a former slave. Free so-called black musicians, cooks, soldiers, and teamsters earned the same pay as so-called white Confederate privates, believe it or not. This was not the case in the Union Army, where so-called black men did not receive equal pay, and that's true. That's also recorded. They didn't receive. They were fighting on the Union for the Union states, but they didn't receive equal pay. They didn't receive for us equipment, clothing, footwear, a lot of stuff. Some of that was I believe was they dropped some of that in the movie Glory with Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman. I don't know how many of you saw that movie, but they showed you that in the movie. So you know that's recorded history. Okay, let me move along here. It says here, at least one so-called black Confederate was a non-commissioned officer, James Washington, Company D, 34th Texas Cavalry. I'm going to say this again. I'm going to repeat this again. At least one so-called black Confederate was a non-commissioned officer, James Washington, Company D, 34th Texas Cavalry, Terrell's Texas Rangers, because it's Third Sergeant, Texas Rangers. How many of you know that they were U.S. Marshals before the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century? How many of you know that? Deputy Marshals. So Texas Rangers, when they became Texas Rangers, that's not that's not a surprise to me, especially when you study history. It'd be a surprise to a lot of people that still don't know. Okay, let me move along. At the Confederate Buffalo Forge in Rockbridge County, Virginia, skilled so-called black workers earned an average 3 times the wage of so-called white Confederate soldiers and more than most Confederate Army officers, $350 to $600 a year. You can believe it or not. I'm going to say this again. At the Confederate Buffalo Forge in Rockbridge County, Virginia, skilled black workers earned an average 3 times the wages of white Confederate soldiers or more than most Confederate armies. Their wages was $350 to $600 a year. That was a lot of money at that time. We're dealing with the 1860s here. Hard to believe, isn't it? But it's recorded history. This is recorded history that I'm reading off to you tonight. Like Wrigley said it on TV a long time ago, Wrigley's Believe It or Not. Like the Honorable Elijah Muhammad said years ago, you can take it or leave it alone. I don't care what you do with it. But these are the facts that I've learned and the facts that I'm sharing with you tonight. Believe it or not. Okay? Says here, Dr. Louis Steiner, Chief Inspector of the United States Sanitary Commission, while observing General Stonewall Jackson's occupation of Frederick, Maryland in 1862. Over 3,000 so-called Negroes must be included in this number. Confederate troops, they were clad in all kinds of uniforms, not only in cast-off or captured United States uniforms, but in coats with Southern buttons, state buttons, etc. They were shabby, but not shabbier or sealer than those worn by so-called white men in the rebel ranks. Most of the Negroes had arms, rifles, muskets, sabers, bowie knives, dirks, etc., and were manifestly an integral portion of the Southern Confederate Army. Believe it or not, Frederick Douglass reported, there are at the present moment many colored men in the Confederate Army doing duty not only as cooks, servants, and laborers, but real soldiers having muskets on their shoulders and bullets in their pockets, ready to shoot down any loyal troops and do all that soldiers may do to destroy the federal government, and builds up that of their belts. Okay, I don't know. The word is kind of messed up, scratched up, so I can't really pronounce what it says here. Okay, it says here, black and white militiamen returned heavy fire on Union troops at the Battle of Grimsmotorville near Macon, Georgia. Approximately 600 boys and elderly men were killed in this skirmish. In 1864, President Jefferson Davis approved a plan that proposed the emancipation of slaves in return for the official recognition of the Confederacy by Britain and France. France showed interest, but Britain refused. I want that to rest with y'all, man. All right, peace, family. I'm back. Okay. Yeah, I was watching earlier. I was watching on YouTube brother holding Confederate flag, and he was questioned and asking why he was carrying the Confederate flag. He had a Confederate uniform on also, and he said that he was just carrying on to the traditions of his family's legacy. You know, he said his family were not slaves, and his family had land, lots of land, through the years that they had built, you know, and harvested all through the years until the Civil War. Yeah, this was a brother. I mean, you know, they never did give his name, but he was carrying the flag, walking up and down the street, waving it, you know. He said, I'm just taking pride in my family's legacy, that's all, you know. He at one time on another YouTube video, he had a shirt on. I believe he owned a restaurant or whatever, and somewhere in the South. He had a shirt with about 3, maybe 4 Moors wearing their Confederate uniforms and Confederate flags in the background. And the young brother asked him, you know, what's up? What's up? Why are you wearing that? No, why are you doing that? You know. And the older brother told the young brother. He said, well, a lot of our history has been, you know, a lot of people have been misled by history, been miscrewed, and it has been mistaught, and people have been lied to big time about the Civil War and about the role that Asiatic people played. You know, said what I'm depicting as I'm talking about free so-called black people. These were free. Some weren't free. Some were slaves. They believed that would free them. And so did a lot of the European so-called white people too. How many of you know that there were only between 5 and 7 slave owners at the time during the Civil War? How many of you know that? But you have a lot of people, if you just go on YouTube and deal with the Confederate flag issue, you know, you had a lot of Asiatic people saying that, you know, this is our heritage. You know, just think about it. If you was coming up during the Civil War, okay, you had land, a lot of land that your family has built over the years, through generations, and somebody said they're going to come down there and take your land from you, take away your sovereignty and everything. Because that was what the real reason what the Civil War was about. It was to take away a lot of property and the sovereignty from the Moors. Wrigley's, believe it or not. And that was to do away sovereignty completely. Once you conquered the South, that was the end of sovereignty. I mentioned this before when General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate forces to General Grant, Union State forces. He surrendered unconditionally, which means he he surrendered everything over to the United States of America, or United States of America, put it that way. Everything. Therefore, he's in even their sovereignty. Not only was a lot of our people were stateless citizens, but although they weren't stateless because they were aboriginal, indigenous, indigenous to this land, but a lot of the Europeans became stateless sovereignty. And the reason why I call them title sovereigns, because they are not the sovereign. It never can be unless they're aboriginal, indigenous, indigenous to this land. If they want to be sovereign, they have to go back to Europe. And there's nothing, what I'm saying is racially biased against them, anything like that. Not at all. But that's the fact, Jack. Not out of hatred for them, is not. I don't waste my energy on hatred. I don't do that. I'm about uplifting fallen humanity. When you talk about uplifting fallen humanity, you're not talking about just Moors. I'm sorry. I'm not talking about that. We're talking about people in general. But yeah, this is let me go on back to this book here. I'm going to read some of these pages out to you. Okay. Says here, the Jackson Battalion included 2 companies of so-called black soldiers. This is the Confederate Army still, okay? They saw combat at Petersburg under Colonel Shipp. And this is Colonel Shipp, the Southern Confederate colonel talking now. He says about the Moors that he fought under him. He says here, my men acted with the utmost promptness and goodwill. Allow me to state, sir, that they behave in an ordinary, extraordinary, acceptable manner. This was a Confederate, high-ranking Confederate European soldier said about us, the soldier Moors that fought up under him. Okay, I'm gonna repeat this. The Jackson Battalion included 2 companies of so-called black soldiers. They saw combat at Petersburg. Colonel Shipp. My men acted with the utmost promptness and goodwill. Allow me to state, sir, that they behave in an ordinary, acceptable manner. It says here, recently, the National Park Service, with a recent discovery, recognized that so-called blacks were asked to help defend the city of Petersburg, Virginia, and were offered their freedom if they did so, regardless of their official classification. So-called black Americans perform support functions that is in today's Army, many would be classified as official military service. The successes of so-called white Confederate troops in battle could only have been achieved with the support these legal so-called black Southerners. But they're saying they couldn't have won without these Moors. But again, I say by myself, me personally, I say maybe it's time for us to start fighting the wars for them and let them fight their own wars. I mean, let's face it. I mean, come on, for ever since the revolution, on up to the date, what did we ever gain from any of those wars? We definitely never did gain any real benefits from it. We need to be fighting for our own for our own liberation, for our own freedom. That's what we should be doing. And I mean by doing that, not by arms, not by physical or armed aggression, by doing this paperwork and getting nationalized programs, among our neighborhoods and our communities. Get the word out. That's what I'm doing, getting the word out. I'm doing my part, getting the word out. You notice I always talk about nationality, so I guess I just had to put that out there. Okay. Let me move on here. The Confederate General John B. Gordon, Army, says in parentheses, Army of Northern Virginia, reported that all of his troops were in favor of colored troops and that its adoption would have greatly encouraged the Army. General Lee was anxious. Here it is. I'm talking about General Robert E. Lee. Those of you who study history know who I'm talking about. Says here, say it again here. General Robert E. Lee was anxious to receive regiments of all so-called black soldiers. The Richmond Sentinel reported on 24th of March, 1864, none will deny that our servants are more worthy of respect than the motley hordes which some against us bad faith two so-called black Confederates must be avoided as an indelible dishonor. In March of 1865, Judah P. Benjamin at that time was the head of the, he was a Jew, or so-called Jew. I call them Zionists myself, but they're not actually Jews. But he was a so-called Jew that was head of the United States Treasury at that time. It says here, on March 1865, Judah P. Benjamin, a Confederate Secretary of State, promised freedom for so-called blacks who served from the state of Virginia. Authority for this was finally received from the state of Virginia, and on April 1st, 1865, $100 bounties were offered to so-called black soldiers. Benjamin exclaimed, "Let us pay to every so-called Negro who wants to go into the ranks and go and fight, and you are free to fight for your masters, or you shall have your own freedom and fight for yourselves." Confederate officers were ordered to treat them humanely and protect them from injustice and oppression. Wrigley's Believe It or Not. It's up to you whether you want to believe this or not, Moors. I'm just reading from what this book, two Moors, a sister, from and her brother from California wrote. Okay, they wrote the book. They done their own research on the Civil War, on dealing with Moors in the South. And this is what they had come up with. These are all documented records. Okay? So a quota was set for 300,000 so-called black soldiers for the Confederate States, colored troops. 838 of Richmond's male slaves population volunteered for Dusty. A special ball was held in Richmond to raise money for uniforms for these men. I'm going to read this again. I know this is hard to believe, but okay, sisters and brothers. A special ball was held in Richmond to raise money for uniforms for these men. Imagine Southern Europeans throwing a ball to raise money for Asiatic soldiers. Unbelievable. But it's recorded. Okay? Before Richmond fell, so-called black Confederates in gray uniforms drilled in the streets. due to the war ending. It is believed only companies or squads of these troops ever saw any action. Many more so-called black soldiers fought for the North, but that difference was simply a difference because the North instituted this progressive policy more conservative, more than the conservative South. So-called black soldiers from both sides received discrimination from so-called whites who opposed the concept. Union General U.S. Grant and February Union General Grant of the United States Army in February 1865 ordered the capture of all the Negro men before the enemy can put them in their ranks. Frederick Douglass warned Lincoln that unless slaves were guaranteed freedom, those in Union-controlled areas were still slaves and land bounties. They would take up arms for the rebels. It says here on April 4th, 1865, Amelia County, Virginia, a Confederate supply train was exclusively manned and guarded by so-called black infantry. When attacked by Federal cavalry, they stood their ground and fought off the charge, but on the second charge, they were overwhelmed. These soldiers were believed to be from Major Turner's Confederate command. A so-called black Confederate, George, whatever his name was, when captured by Federals, was bribed to desert to the other side. He defiantly spoke, said, "Sir, you want me to desert, and I ain't no deserter. Down south, deserters disgrace their uniform and their families, and I'm never going to do that." Former slaves, Horace King accumulated great wealth as a contractor to the Confederate Navy. He was also an expert engineer and became known as the bridge builder of the Confederacy. This was some more, okay? One of his bridges were burned in a Yankee raid. His home was pillaged by Union troops as his wife pleaded for mercy. As of February 1865, 1,150 so-called black seamen served in the Confederate Navy. One of these were among the last Confederate to surrender. Aboard the Shenandoah, 6 months after the war ended, this surrender took place in England. Ain't that something? Nearly 180,000 so-called black Southerners from Virginia alone provided logistical support for the Confederate military. Many were highly skilled workers. These included a wide range of jobs: nurses, military engineers, teamsters, ordnance department workers, brakemen, firemen, harness makers, blacksmiths, wagon makers, boatmen, mechanics, wheelwrights, etc. In the 1920s, Confederate pensions were finally allowed to these workers that were still living. Many thousands more served in other Confederate states. So this is the end about dealing with the Moors, dealing with the Confederate Army in the South. A lot of this I just read to you, like I said, this was research by a brother and a sister. And the Moors, like I said, Sister Naji Ulael and Brother Taylor L, both from the West Coast in California. They done long and hard artist research on this. So like I said, I don't have their numbers or anything. I would have give you their phone numbers for more comment on that. But these are supposed to be facts. Those are people dealing with the South. These were, like I said, a lot of them, as I just read in the book, a lot of them were not slaves and never were slaves. They were just fighting for what was theirs. I mean, somebody come tell you they're going to come down here and take your land from you after many generations, the generation that your family have worked for, hard for, you know, what would you do? Would you let them come down and take your land and your property away from you? Or would you fight? Now let that rest with you all that's listening tonight. Now, here we go here. I'm just reading a few things from what they call the book by Michael A. Hoffman II. It's called They Were White and They Were Slaves, The Untold History of Enslavement of Whites in Early America. Now, this is in America. The other part I was talking to you about slavery over there in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Coast. But this is here in America. I'm going to read this off again. The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America. The author name is Michael A. Hoffman II, if you want to get the book. For those who don't, those of you probably already have the book. I'm not sure. Okay? It says here, there are two sorts. First, such as were bought over by masters of ships to be sold as servants, such as we call them, my dear, says she, but they are more properly called slaves. This is a history of white people that has never been told in any coherent form, largely because most modern historians have, for reasons of politics or psychology, refused to recognize so-called white slaves in early America as just that. Today, not a tear is shed for the suffering of millions of own enslaved forefathers. 200 years of white slavery in America have been almost completely obliterated from the collective memory of the American people. See, they used to. Now, okay, they used to bring a lot of so-called, like they said, millions. Like you said, not a tear shed because that's been wiped out from the history books. A brother, my dear friend, brother Abdullah El-Bey has stated that in his video, The Moorish History. And he said that they don't want that out, that we once had power over them. Who were the original Americans? Moors. They thought in history they had you to think that they can just come back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. You know, nothing hindering them or nothing like that. Nobody molested them or nothing like that. But that was not true. That was a falsehood. That was a blatant lie. They had to pay the Moors tribute payments, or else the Moors would seize their ships. And sometimes they would do it anyway. And that's when they seized their ships, they would seize the slaves that were on the ships as well. Some of their own so-called white brethren sold their people to the Moors. They didn't care. Profit was profit. If you watch this program on YouTube, this is a European telling the story. I don't know how true it is or not. You can determine that for yourself. He said that the European slave masters of other European slaves used to sell or give a lot of the European women over to the Moor slaves and under the Moors. They wanted to make a third, or what you call a third type of race. And it said it was at an alarming rate, at a high alarming rate. They did that. They did these things to their own women. It wasn't just us selling them. No, it wasn't really a racial thing. Like I said it, and I say it again. Europeans were the first slaves in the Americas. They were the very first. Let me go on here. Okay, this is a history of so-called white people that has never been told as coherent form, largely because most modern historians have, for reasons of politics or psychology, refused to recognize so-called white slaves in early America as just that. Today, not a tear is shed for the suffering of millions of what he says, of their own people enslaved. Forefathers, 200 years of white slavery in America have been almost completely obliterated from the collective memory of the American people. Who wants to be reminded that more than half, perhaps as many as 2/3 of the original European colonists came here not of their own free will, but kidnapped, shanghaied, impressed, duped, beguiled, and yes, in chains? ? We tend to gloss over it. We would prefer to forget the whole story. A correct understanding of the authentic history of the enslavement of so-called whites in America could have profound consequences for the future of the races. We cannot be sure that the position of the earliest Africans differed markedly from that of the white indentured servants. The debate has considerable significance for the interpretation of race relations in American history. This says here by Eugene D. Genovese. To the Third World Slaves. Okay, most of the books on white labor in early America are titled with words like white indentured servitude, white bond servants, white service, etc. It is interesting that white people who were bound to a condition of what became, in many cases, permanent chattel slavery and to death are not referred to as slaves by establishment academics. With the massive concentration of educational and media resources on the Negro or so-called Negro experience of slavery, the unspoken assumption has been that only so-called blacks have been enslaved to any degree or magnitude worthy of study or memorial. The historical record reveals that this is not the case. However, so-called white people have been sold as slaves for centuries. It says here, Arabs and the traffic in so-called white slaves. Okay, the trade in white slaves were one of the few sources of foreign exchange for Western European powers in a period when the East produced the goods. The East produced the goods. We're talking about Moors. Here we go again. And that Europeans could not procure elsewhere. The sale of white slaves to Asia and Africa was one of the few sources of gold for European treasures. I'll say this again. The sale of white slaves to Asia and Africa was one of the few sources of gold for European treasures. Now, Africa. At the early part of that slave trade, Europeans didn't have no control nowhere on the African continent. So who was buying these slaves? Who was buying them in Asia and Africa? Who was buying them? Take a big guess. I would say Moors, African Moors, and Moors in Asia, and other Asians. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Let me move along. From the 8th to the 11th century was a major transfer point for so-called white slaves to the Muslim world. Notice they use the word Muslim instead of Moor, okay? But we all know who they're talking about, right? Okay. With Rouen being the center for the selling of Irish and Flemish slaves. At the same time that France was a transfer point of slaves at the Muslim world, Italy was occupying with the same position. Venetians selling slaves and timber across the Mediterranean. The slaves were usually Slavs. Let me repeat it again. The slaves were usually Slavs brought across the Alps. Venetians were the earliest successful Italian sea traders, and because profits on slave trade with the Muslims were lucrative, they resisted efforts to stop them. Turn for their exports of timber, iron, and white slaves. They brought in Oriental luxury products, mainly fine cloth. The stereotype from establishing consensus history is of the Muslim slaver herding chain so-called blacks through the desert. In fact, for 700 years until the fall of Muslim Spain, or Moorish Spain, those being herded were first and foremost overwhelmingly white. You got it? I'll read this again. The stereotype from establishment consensus history is of the Muslim slaver herding chain so-called blacks through the desert. In fact, for 700 years until the fall of Moorish Spain, those being herded were first and foremost overwhelmingly so-called white. Before the 10th century, the Muslims generally bought Christian Europeans as slaves. Start it again. Before the 10th century, the Muslims generally bought Christian Europeans as slaves. By the 10th century, Slavs became the most numerous imported group. During the late Middle Ages until the fall of Granada in the late 15th century, most Slavs and of the Moors were Christians from the northern kingdoms. In the vast lands of Eastern Europe, steps from the 8th or the 12th century, there was a well-developed slaving network. Slavs and Finns called Sasquatba, slaves, indiscriminately by Moors, entered the Moorish world by the Caspian Sea and Black Sea routes. The fate of the hundreds of thousands of white slaves sold to the Arabs was described as one Spanish as atrocious, most atrocious and harsh. These men were worked to death as galley slaves. The women, girls, and boys was used as prostitutes. This is what's been going on. Says here, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the word slave is another name for white people of Eastern Europe, the Slavs. I repeat. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word slave is another name for white people of Eastern Europe called Slavs. Didn't I mention that earlier in the Blog Talk Show? Yes, I did. And move along here. It says here, the English historian William Cobbett stated in 1836, the starving agricultural laborers of southern England are worse off than American Negroes. Those of you want to believe that? You can. Don't. Says here, the letter P stood for a word which had already acquired its lasting stigma, pauper. So this is what I'm talking about, true history. Nothing nobody fabricated or lied or made up, you know. But it's at your own discretion whether you believe it or not. Says here, the history of enslavement in America as portrayed, okay, the history of enslavement in America as portrayed in the tunnel vision of the corporate media has focused exclusively on the enslavement of so-called blacks or Negroes. The impression is given that only so-called whites bear responsibility for enslaving so-called Negroes, and only Negroes were slaves. In fact, so-called Negroes in Africa, as well as American so-called Indian tribes, such as the Cherokee, engaged in extensive enslavement of so-called Negroes. That's also true. The Cherokee were Moors. That's the part they don't tell you. So they're trying to get you to see that they were some of them were Moors. Some of them look like the Indians that they show you on television and in the movies. But the Cherokee, so-called Cherokee Indians were Moors as well. Says here, the Cherokee Indians owned large plantations on which they worked their Negro slaves in gangs. Says here, read the book Red Over Black, Slavery Among the Cherokee Indians. Okay? Says here, so-called white slaves were actually owned by Negroes and Indians in the South. I'm going to read this again. This is documented history. Listen. White slaves were actually owned by Negroes and Indians in the South, to such an extent that the Virginia Assembly passed the following law in 1670. This was only in Virginia, but the rest of the 10 states, other Confederate states of America, Moors owned slaves. Okay, it is enacted that no Negro or Indian, though baptized or enjoy their own freedom, shall be capable of any such purchase of Christians. Like I told you before, they always identify Christians of being Europeans. They always use Christianity and Europeans as both synonymous terms. Okay? It says here, I'm going to read that again. Read it again. It says here, it is enacted that no Negro or Indian, through baptized and enjoy their own freedom, shall be capable of any such purchase of Christians. Okay? It says here, during the War of 1812, the British ranks included approximately 300 armed American so-called Negroes who were used in combat against American forces. They call them, that's when they start taking our birthright away from us. American forces. Can you get that? But we are the Aborigine, Indigenous, Autochthonous Americans, but they want to call them Americans. If you read the book, read Northwestern's book, 1828 edition, it will show you quite clearly that the various copper-colored races were the original Americans. When the European people first came upon these shores, they found that the original Americans were the various copper-colored races. But now the title is pertaining to the European people. Birthright theft. Birthright theft at its best. Some of these so-called Negroes helped the British burn the White House in 1814. They burned it down to asunder. How many of you know that the White House at Washington, D.C. is not the original White House? That was burned down in the War of 1812. It says here in small print, a few so-called blacks fought on the side of the Americans during the Revolution, including some Massachusetts Negroes known as Bucks of America. The claim has been made that the first victim of the British in the American Revolutionary was a black. And it was a Moor, Crispus Attucks. In fact, Attucks was an Indian, a descendant of John Attucks, a Nanticoke, who had battled American pioneers in King Philip's War. Now, you know the Nanticoke are Moors, but it goes to show you Michael A. Hoffman II, a European writer. So it goes to show you how much we need to study our culture and history, because even a lot of these European writers and authors, they will confuse you. They think we don't know. The Nanticoke was a Moorish national tribe, or Aborigine indigenous people of this country. Got to learn how to read between the lines, boys. The book I refer you to get to have a part of your library, though. Says here, poor so-called whites had to be drafted into the Confederate Army, and in the North, where resistance to conscription was widespread. Many so-called Southern whites saw the conflict as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Indeed, any slaveholder owning 20 or more so-called black slaves was exempt from military combat. The official papers of the so-called white slave, adult white slaves as freight, and wild child slaves were termed as half freight. Like any other commodity of the shipping and inventories, so-called white human beings were seen strictly in terms of market economics by merchants. Says here, the colonies were plentifully supplied with so-called Negro and Christian servants, which are the nerves and sinews of the plantation. Christian was a human related for so-called white people, as I said earlier. Called here euphemism for white, because they always were both synonymous terms. But they use the term Negro instead of Moor. Then you had Moors, then you had Negroes. I would suggest you read Jose Pimienta Bay's book, Othello's Children in the West. I didn't like the title of the book, but you need to go and get that book. Very informative book. dealing with status as Negroes, colored, and black, or more. These were statuses, not identities. Says here, hundreds of thousands of whites in colonial America were owned outright by their masters and died in slavery. They had no control over their own lives and were auctioned on the block and examined like livestock, exactly like so-called black slaves, with the exception that these white slaves were enslaved by their own race. Like I explained earlier, a lot of them sold to the more slave masters, especially their women. And a lot of the slave trade, during the slave trade, a lot of slaves were shipped across from the Americas, from the Americas across the Atlantic to Europe and Africa. It was the other way around at first. Then later on, they started grabbing a few people from Africa, and most of them landed in the South American continent because the waters were too rough for them to cross straight from Africa to the North American continent. So they had to take a different route. If I had a show and I had a map, I can show you what I'm talking about. That's why they call it the Atlantic slave trade, rather than the African slave trade. If you've noticed, that's the term they use now. It says here the Virginia Company, which was the company what it called the United States at first. The Virginia Company named after the Virgin Queen of England. Those of you that did know, I know that those of you who do know, after the Virgin Queen of England, that's why they call it Virginia. The Virginia Company arranged with the city of London to have 100 poor so-called white children out of the swarms in the place sent to Virginia in 1619 for the sale of wealthy planters in the colony to be used as slave labor. The Privy Council of London authorized the Virginia Company to imprison, punish, and dispose of any of those children upon or any disorder of them committed as cause shall require. The term indentured servitude, therefore, is nothing more than a propagandistic softening up of the historic experience of enslaved European people in order to make a false distinction between their sufferings and those of so-called Negro slaves. A lot of these European children, the 10,000 so-called whites, were kidnapped from England in the year 1670 alone. History of the United States, Volume 2, by Edward Channing. History of the United States, Volume 2, page 369. The very word kidnapper was first coined in Britain in the 1600s to describe those who captured and sold white children into slavery. At that time, it was known as kidnappers. Kidnappers, K-I-D hyphen A-N hyphen N-A-B-B-E-R-S. Kidnappers. That's where the word kidnap comes from. That's where it originated. That's where the word kidnap originated from the kidnapping of European children from England to be slaves here in America. So this is the story has been told. You know, you want to get the book. I suggest you to get the book. Again, I suggest you get the book. They Were White and They Were Slaves: The Untold Story of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America by Michael A. Hoffman II. And you might mind getting the book called Black Slave Owners. Black Slave Owners. It says Free Black Slave Masters in South Carolina from 1790 to 1860. Okay, by Larry Koger. By Larrykoger. Larry Koger. And you will also get the book also called White Cargo: The Forgotten History of Britain's White Slaves in America by Don Jordan and Michael Wash. And another book of interest, you want to get White Slaves, African Masters. Say it again, White Slaves, African Masters by a Paul Bapler. That's the author's name. Okay? And his last book, but most you get here, called Black Property Owners in the South, 1790-1915. I repeat, Black Property Owners in the South, 1790-1915, by Lauren Schwaminger. By Lauren Schwaminger. Okay, I guess he's German. These will be a book of interest. It deals with the topic I was talking to you tonight. So it's almost time for me to hang it up. I hope those of you who listen tonight, I hope I have enough listeners tonight that will listen to me what I was trying to tell them and everything. And I hope it was very informative. I don't mean to insult anyone. I don't mean to, all I mean is to educate. Well, with a little I have been educated with. Until then, as I say tonight, Bawasama Dakunda, peace, family. Hawate Washita East. May my spirit and your spirit spring forth with the jaguar. Peace.